Danny Reed's life was quiet and predictable until a routine trip to the grocery store leads to his wrongful arrest. Humiliated and confused, Danny soon uncovers a shocking truth. His father, a man he never knew, was a respected civil rights leader. Now, Danny must decide whether to step into his father's legacy and fight for justice in a divided town, or remain in the background as tensions rise. What will Danny do? How will the town of Colston react to the truths they've ignored for so long? Let me know in the comments how you'd handle being in Danny's situation, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. Now let's dive in. Danny Reed liked his routine. He liked the predictability, the sense of peace that came with knowing how his day would unfold. At 44 years old, he had settled into a comfortable rhythm. His job as an IT professional allowed him to work regular hours, and while it was glamorous, it paid the bills and gave him the quiet life he cherished. Danny lived in the small town of Colston, just outside Atlanta, where he had grown up. The town hadn't changed much over the years: tree-lined streets, small shops, and a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone. It was a far cry from the big city, but that was fine with Danny. Colston was home. It was where his mother, Grace Reed, had raised him after his father disappeared from their lives when Danny was just a baby. Grace had done everything for him, and even now they were close. She was his rock, his constant in a world that could sometimes feel uncertain. That Friday, like every Friday, Danny shut down his computer at exactly 4:00 p.m. He glanced at the clock and smiled. Another day done, another week behind him. As he packed up his briefcase, he thought about the quiet weekend ahead. No big plans, just time to relax, maybe watch a movie with his mom, and catch up on a few things around the house. But first, he had his usual errand to run. Grocery day. The drive to the local supermarket was short, just a few minutes from his house. As he navigated the familiar streets, he hummed along to the smooth jazz playing on the radio. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was still high, casting long golden shadows over the sidewalks. People were out and about, enjoying the warm weather. He waved to a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, as she watered her garden, and she waved back with a smile. When Danny arrived at the grocery store, the automatic doors slid open with a soft swoosh, and the cool blast of air conditioning greeted him. He grabbed a cart and began his usual route through the aisles, selecting the same items he always did: whole wheat bread, milk, some vegetables, a few cans of soup, and a carton of eggs. As he reached for a box of cereal, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to grab something from a high shelf. Without hesitation, Danny walked over. "Excuse me, Mom, may I help you with that?" he asked, his voice kind. The woman, frail and bent with age, looked up at him with a grateful smile. "Oh, thank you, young man. These old bones aren't what they used to be." Danny retrieved the item for her, and as he handed it to her, he felt a warm glow of satisfaction. These small acts of kindness made him feel connected to his community, like he was part of something bigger. He didn't need recognition or praise, it was just who he was. Colston had always been a place where people looked out for one another, and Danny was proud to continue that tradition. By the time he made it to the checkout, the young cashier greeted him by name. "Hey, Mr. Reed, how's your mom doing?" "She's doing well, thanks for asking," Danny replied, smiling. He'd been coming to this store for years, and by now, most of the staff knew him. They exchanged some pleasant small talk as the cashier rang up his items, and soon enough, Danny was back outside, loading his groceries into the trunk of his car. As he drove home, the familiar calm settled over him. This was his life: simple, predictable, peaceful, and he liked it that way. Little did he know that in just a few short hours, everything he thought he knew about himself and his world would be turned upside down. The streets were quiet as Danny drove back through his neighborhood. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting a soft golden hue over the houses. It was the perfect evening, a little cool, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees lining the streets. Danny loved this time of day, the peaceful transition from afternoon to evening. It felt like a pause, a moment to breathe before the night fully set in. He pulled into his driveway, parked his car, and began unloading the groceries. The air smelled faintly of blooming flowers from nearby gardens, and the distant sound of children laughing and playing drifted through the neighborhood. Danny smiled to himself as he carried the bags up the short walkway to his front door. It was another ordinary, uneventful day in Colston, and that was exactly how he liked it. As he stepped inside and set the bags on the kitchen counter, Danny's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his mother, reminding him to call her later about a family event that was coming up. He chuckled. Even though they talked almost every day, Grace still liked to remind him of things, as if she feared he might forget. He sent her a quick reply, "Will do, Mom." With the groceries put away, Danny decided to take a short walk around the block. It was something he did often to clear his head, especially after a long day of work. The streets were quiet now, the sounds of the day fading into the gentle hum of crickets. He walked leisurely, his hands in his pockets, enjoying the cool air on his skin. But the peace was short-lived. As he turned the corner onto his street, the sudden wail of police sirens pierced the quiet. The sound was jarring, and Danny's heart skipped a beat. He turned to see several police cars speeding toward him, their lights flashing. For a moment he froze, confused. Were they responding to an emergency robbery? Maybe. The cars screeched to a halt, surrounding him in an instant. The doors flew open, and several officers jumped out, their movements swift and aggressive. Danny's heart raced, panic rising in his chest. What was happening? Before he could fully process the situation, one of the officers, Officer Mark Dawson, shouted, "Put your hands where we can see them." Danny's stomach dropped. Why he hadn't done anything wrong? This had to be some kind of mistake. "Officer, what's going on?" Danny asked, his voice shaking as he slowly raised his hands, palms out. "Get on the ground," another officer barked. It was a woman this time, Officer Rachel Parker. Her voice was harsh, commanding, with no room for questions. Danny's mind raced, fear and confusion tangling together. He had no idea what was happening. Why were they treating him like this? He hadn't done anything. He had just been on a walk, a quiet evening walk in his own neighborhood. "Officer, please," Danny started to explain, but his words were cut off as the officers rushed him. Two of them grabbed his arms, yanking them behind his back with such force that he stumbled forward, hitting the pavement hard. The cold, rough concrete scraped against his face as they forced him onto his stomach. The weight of one officer's knee pressed down on his back, and Danny winced as his wrists were cuffed, the metal biting into his skin. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, choked by the terror surging through him. "What did I do?" Danny managed to ask, his voice small, barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. "You know what you did?" Officer Dawson snapped, his voice low and menacing. "Don't play dumb." Danny's mind reeled. What was he talking about? He hadn't done anything. He was just coming back from the store grocery shopping, for God's sake. "There's been a robbery," Officer Parker said coldly as she stood over him. "Convenience store 2 blocks from here. The suspect's description matches you, middle-aged black male, dark jacket. You were seen near the scene." Danny's heart sank. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. No, he stammered, his voice shaky with desperation. "That's not me. I wasn't there. I just got back from the grocery store. You can check, I have a receipt. I was at the store." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, their suspicion unwavering. "A likely story," Officer Dawson scoffed as he hauled Danny to his feet. "We've got witnesses, pal. Save it for the station." Danny's world felt like it was collapsing around him. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. How had his quiet, peaceful life spiraled into this nightmare? The officers pushed him roughly toward the waiting patrol car, and as they did, Danny noticed something that made his stomach twist with shame and humiliation. His neighbors. They were watching some from their windows, others standing on their porches. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman he had waved to just that afternoon, was standing at the edge of her yard, her hand over her mouth, in shock. A few of the kids who had been playing in the street earlier were now gathered together, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Danny's heart ached. These people knew him. They had seen him every day for years. And now they were watching as he was treated like a common criminal. As the officers shoved him into the back seat of the patrol car and slammed the door shut, Danny felt a sinking dread settle in his chest. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The ride to the police station felt like a blur. The flashing red and blue lights flickered across the windows, casting eerie shadows over the quiet streets of Colston. Danny sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed tightly behind him, his mind racing. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. The officers hadn't listened to him, hadn't even given him a chance to explain. The sound of the siren, the sensation of cold metal on his wrists, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, all of it swirled together in his mind, creating a storm of fear and confusion. When they finally arrived at the station, the officers pulled Danny out of the car and led him inside, his hands still bound behind his back. The station was cold and sterile, the harsh fluorescent lights making everything seem even more surreal. Danny had never been in trouble with the law before. He had always respected the police, believed in the system. But now, he felt like he was caught in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Officer Parker led him to a small interrogation room where the walls seemed to close in on him. The room was bare except for a metal table and 2 chairs. Danny sat down, his wrists still cuffed behind him, and waited in silence. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. He hadn't been near any convenience store. He had been at the grocery store like he was every Friday. He had a receipt to prove it. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Officer Dawson walked in, followed by Officer Parker. They took their seats across from him, their faces hard, their expressions unreadable. Dawson opened a folder and pulled out a piece of paper, placing it on the table in front of him. "We know you were involved in the robbery," Dawson said, his voice cold and accusing. "We've got witnesses who saw a man matching your description leaving the scene." Danny shook his head, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I wasn't there. I've been at the grocery store all evening. I have a receipt. You can check the security cameras. I didn't do anything wrong." Officer Parker leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You're saying you were at the store the whole time?" "Yes," Danny replied, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can give you my alibi. Please, check the cameras, call the store, anything." "I didn't do this." The officers exchanged glances, and Dawson sighed. "Well, look into it," he said, his tone dismissive. "But right now, you're staying here until we get more information." Danny felt a wave of frustration wash over him. They weren't listening. They didn't believe him. He had been wrongly accused, and no matter what he said, it felt like they had already made up their minds. "Why are you doing this?" Danny asked, his voice cracking. "Why won't you just check my alibi?" Officer Parker crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "Look, you match the description, and we're just doing our job. If you're innocent, the evidence will clear you." Danny felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. He had always believed in justice, in fairness. But now, sitting in this cold, sterile room, it was hard to hold on to that belief. The officers left the room, leaving Danny alone with his thoughts. He slumped in the chair, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had a simple trip to the grocery store turned into this? He thought about his mother, Grace. She was probably wondering where he was by now. She'd be worried sick if she knew what was happening. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, the door opened again, and Officer Dawson stepped inside, his expression tight. There was something different in his demeanor, something uneasy. "We've reviewed the footage from the grocery store," Dawson said, his voice softer than before. "It shows you were there during the time of the robbery. You're free to go." Relief flooded Danny's chest, but it was quickly replaced by anger. This should never have happened. He had told them from the start that he was innocent, but they hadn't listened. They had treated him like a criminal, humiliated him in front of his neighbors, and now they were just going to let him go like nothing had happened. But there was something else in Dawson's expression, something that made Danny pause. "There's something else," Dawson added, hesitating. "We ran a background check as part of the process. Your father, Paul Reedy, was well. He was someone important. We didn't realize who you were." Danny blinked, confusion washing over him. "What do you mean?" Officer Dawson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Your father was a prominent civil rights leader. We didn't know. Danny felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. His father, Paul Reed, the father he had never known, the father his mother rarely spoke about, had been a civil rights leader. I didn't know, Danny stammered. I never knew. The officer's tone softened. Look, I'm sorry for what happened. We were just following procedure, but we didn't know your family history. Danny barely heard him. His mind was spinning, trying to process this new information. His father, a civil rights leader, why hadn't his mother told him? Why had she kept this from him all these years? I can't believe this, Danny muttered, shaking his head. I need to go home. Dawson nodded, standing up and uncuffing him. You're free to go. Again, we're sorry for the misunderstanding. But Danny wasn't listening anymore. He stood up, his thoughts racing, his emotions a tangled mess. He needed answers. He needed to understand who his father had been, and why this had all been kept from him. As he walked out of the station and into the cool night air, he knew one thing for certain: life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. By the time Danny got home, the weight of the evening had begun to press down on him. The quiet of his house, normally a source of comfort, now felt stifling. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. The arrest, the accusations, the fact that his father had been someone important, someone he had never really known. He was reeling from it all, and the questions in his mind were growing louder with each passing minute. Grace was waiting for him when he walked through the door. She had been sitting in her favorite armchair, her knitting on her lap, but when she saw him, she immediately stood up, concern etched on her face. Danny, where have you been? I was getting worried. Danny dropped his keys on the counter and rubbed his hands over his face. I was at the police station. Her eyes widened in shock. What? Why? What happened? They thought I was involved in a robbery, Danny replied, his voice bitter. They arrested me, humiliated me in front of the neighbors, and dragged me down to the station. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with fear. Oh my God, Danny! Are you okay? Did they hurt you? I'm fine, Mom, he said, though the truth was, he wasn't fine at all. He was angry, confused, and hurt in ways he couldn't fully explain. They eventually realized I was innocent, but only after they treated me like a criminal. Grace shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and concern. I can't believe this. I'm so sorry you went through that. Danny's mind was still swirling, but there was something else he needed to know. Something that had been dropped on him so unexpectedly that he still couldn't wrap his head around it. Mom, he said slowly, his voice steady, why didn't you tell me about Dad? Grace froze, her eyes wide with shock. What are you talking about? The police told me, Danny replied. They ran a background check, and they found out that Dad was a civil rights leader. Why didn't you ever tell me that? Grace's face fell, and she sank back into her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and filled with regret. I didn't want you to carry that burden, she said, her eyes downcast. Your father was a great man, Danny. He did important work, but it was dangerous. There were always threats, always risks. I didn't want that for you. I wanted to give you a normal life, free from the weight of his legacy. Danny's heart ached. He had always wondered about his father, but he had never pressed his mother for answers, trusting that she had her reasons for not talking about him. But now, knowing what his father had done, knowing that he had been a part of something so important, Danny felt a sense of loss he hadn't expected. I had a right to know, Danny said, his voice thick with emotion. I had a right to know who he was, what he stood for. Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I know, she whispered, and am sorry. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was wrong. Danny sank into the chair across from her, his mind still reeling. He had spent his whole life not knowing the truth about his father. And now, in the span of a few hours, everything had changed. He wasn't sure how to feel, wasn't sure what this new information meant for him. Tell me about him, Danny said quietly. Tell me who he was. Grace wiped her eyes and nodded. Your father, Paul, was a man of great conviction. He believed in justice, in equality, and he fought for those things every day of his life. He was a leader in the civil rights movement, organizing protests, speaking at rallies, and fighting against the injustices that so many people of color faced. Danny listened, his heart heavy with a mixture of pride and sadness. He had spent his whole life wondering about his father, and now he was finally learning who he had been. But there was also a sense of loss for the relationship they had never had, for the father he had never known. The following morning, Danny woke up feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. He had hardly slept, his mind too consumed with thoughts of the previous day, the wrongful arrest, the revelation about his father, and the difficult conversation with his mother. Grace was in the kitchen making coffee when he came downstairs. Her face was still drawn, her usual warmth replaced by the lingering worry of what had happened to her son. "Good morning," she said quietly, handing him a cup of coffee. "Morning," Danny replied, sitting down at the table. He took a sip, letting the warmth of the drink ease some of the tension in his chest. But it wasn't enough to chase away the heaviness that had settled over him. For a while they sat in silence, the weight of the previous day still hanging between them. Grace busied herself with small tasks, tidying up the kitchen, refilling her coffee cup, but Danny could tell that she was still upset. And he couldn't blame her. His arrest had shaken them both, and the revelation about his father had only added to the emotional turmoil. Finally, Grace sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. "Danny," she said, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last night. About your father. And I realize now that I should have told you sooner." Danny nodded, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to say. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid," Grace continued, her voice wavering. "Your father's work was important, but it was also dangerous. There were times when I thought we would lose him. There were threats, phone calls in the middle of the night, people watching our house. It was terrifying. And when he was gone, I didn't want you to have to live with that fear. I wanted to protect you, to give you a life that was free from the dangers he faced." Danny listened, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He understood now, more than ever, why his mother had made the choices she had. But it didn't take away the sting of not knowing his father's legacy, not knowing who he was. "I know you were trying to protect me, Mom," Danny said quietly. "But I had a right to know. I should have known about him." Grace nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You're right," she whispered. "I see that now. I'm so sorry, Danny." They sat in silence for a while, the air between them thick with emotion. Grace wiped her eyes, and Danny took a deep breath, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of feelings that had overtaken him. Over the next few days, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been upended. The revelation about his father had cracked open something inside of him, something he hadn't even realized was missing. He had spent his entire life believing that his father had abandoned him and his mother. But now he knew the truth. Paul Reed had been a man of conviction, a man who had fought for justice and equality. But what did that mean for Danny? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Everywhere he went, the arrest weighed on him like a dark cloud. It had been a mistake, he knew that now, but it wasn't just a personal mistake. It was part of a larger problem, a system that saw black men like him as suspects before they saw them as people. He couldn't stop thinking about how easily it had happened. The officers hadn't asked questions, hadn't listened to his explanations. They had simply assumed he was guilty because he fit a description. And now that he knew who his father was, it was impossible not to see the parallels. Paul Reed had fought against this very kind of injustice. He had given his life to fight for the rights of people who were marginalized, people who were judged and mistreated because of the color of their skin. And now, decades later, his son had experienced the same thing. Danny didn't know what to do with that knowledge. He wasn't his father. He wasn't a leader or an activist. He was just a man who wanted to live a quiet life. But now, the weight of his father's legacy was pressing down on him, and he wasn't sure he could ignore it any longer. News of Danny's arrest spread quickly through the small town of Colston. A neighbor had recorded the incident on their phone, and the video had been posted online. It didn't take long for it to go viral, sparking outrage in the community. People were shocked and angry that someone as well-known and respected as Danny Reed could be treated this way by the police. For the first time in his life, Danny found himself at the center of attention, and he didn't like it. Strangers reached out to offer their support, while local civil rights groups called, offering legal assistance and asking if Danny wanted to speak publicly about his experience. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and notifications, but Danny ignored most of them. He wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, not yet. At the same time, there were others in the town who dismissed the incident as a simple mistake, nothing more than a misunderstanding. They argued that the police were just doing their job, that they had acted on the information they had at the time. To them, it was no big deal. But to Danny, it was a very big deal. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what this said about the system as a whole. If this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And it likely had many times before. The pressure was mounting. People were looking to him for guidance, for leadership. But Danny wasn't sure he was up to the task. He wasn't his father. He wasn't a civil rights leader. He was just a man who had been caught up in something much bigger than himself. One evening, as Danny sat alone in his living room, scrolling through the countless messages and comments on his phone, he realized that he couldn't stay silent. He couldn't just let this moment pass without doing something. His father had fought for justice, for equality, for change. And now it was his turn. The days after Danny's arrest were filled with uncertainty. The video continued to circulate online, sparking conversations about racial profiling and police conduct in small towns like Colston. But amid the noise, one message stood out to Danny. It was from Reverend Joseph Adams, a man who had worked closely with Danny's father, Paul Reed, during the height of the civil rights movement. Reverend Adams had been a friend to Paul and, more importantly, had witnessed firsthand the battles Paul had fought. "Danny, I'm so sorry about what happened to you. We need to talk," the message read. Danny had known Reverend Adams growing up, though he hadn't seen him in years. The Reverend's church, Ebenezer Baptist, had been a cornerstone of the community for decades. Paul Reed had preached there often, using it as a gathering place for activists and community members who were fighting against the segregation that had plagued the South. Danny wasn't sure if he was ready to step into his father's world, but something about Reverend Adams' message felt like an invitation to understand more about Paul, about the movement, and maybe about what he was supposed to do now. He arranged to meet Reverend Adams at the church that afternoon. The building was old, its brick exterior weathered by time, but it still stood tall, a symbol of hope and resilience in the heart of Colston. As Danny approached, he felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity. He hadn't been here since he was a child. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet, the only sound coming from the soft creak of the wooden pews as Reverend Adams moved around near the altar. When he saw Danny, the older man smiled warmly and approached, his gait slow but steady. "Danny, it's been too long," Reverend Adams said, extending a hand. Danny shook it, the Reverend's grip firm despite his age. "Yeah, it has. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." Reverend Adams chuckled, his voice deep and soothing. "I could never forget Paul Reed's son. You have his eyes, you know, same way they light up when you're thinking hard about something." Danny felt a flicker of pride at the mention of his father. He had always wondered if he carried any part of Paul with him. And now, hearing it from someone who had known Paul so well, it felt like a connection was finally being made. "I don't know where to start," Danny admitted, sitting down in one of the pews. "I didn't even know who my father really was until a few days ago." Reverend Adams nodded, his face thoughtful. "Your father was a man of conviction, Danny. He wasn't afraid to stand up, even when it was dangerous. But more than that, Paul believed in people. He believed in the power of community, of bringing people together to demand justice." Danny listened intently as Reverend Adams began to share stories of his father's stories, of the marches Paul had led, the protests he had organized, and the threats he had faced. The more Danny heard, the more he realized that his father had been part of something much bigger than himself. Paul Reed hadn't just been a man, he had been a symbol of hope, a beacon for people who had been oppressed for so long. But it wasn't just about the big moments, Reverend Adams said, his voice softening. "Your father understood that change starts with the small things, the everyday acts of kindness, the conversations that open people's eyes. That's where real progress happens. Danny sat quietly, absorbing the weight of his father's legacy. It was both inspiring and daunting. How could he ever live up to that? He wasn't an activist. He wasn't a leader. He was just Danny Reed, a man who liked his quiet life and didn't want to be thrust into the spotlight. "You don't have to be Paul," Reverend Adams said, as if reading Danny's mind. "You just have to be you. But you've been given an opportunity here, Danny. What happened to you was wrong, but it's opened people's eyes. Now it's up to you to decide what you're going to do with that." Danny nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but he knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. Not anymore. After his meeting with Reverend Adams, Danny knew he had to do something. The community was looking to him, not just because of what had happened to him, but because they trusted him. He had always been a quiet leader, someone people could count on. But now, they needed him to be more than that. They needed him to stand up and demand accountability. The first step, Danny decided, was to confront the police directly. He couldn't let what had happened to him go unanswered. The town needed to know that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated, not in Colston, and not anywhere else. Danny arranged a meeting with Captain Samuel McCullough, the head of the Colston Police Department, along with the officers involved in his arrest, Mark Dawson and Rachel Parker. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and as the day approached, Danny's nerves began to build. He had never been the confrontational type, and the idea of sitting across from the people who had wrongfully arrested him made his stomach churn. But this wasn't just about him, it was about justice. The meeting was held in a small, sterile conference room at the police station. The tension in the air was thick as Danny took his seat across from Captain McCullough, Dawson, and Parker. McCullough was a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, while Dawson and Parker sat quietly, their eyes downcast. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reed," Captain McCullough began, his voice calm but formal. "We're here to discuss the incident that occurred last week and to address your concerns." Danny took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I appreciate the meeting, Captain, but this isn't just about addressing concerns. What happened to me was unacceptable. I was treated like a criminal without any evidence. I was humiliated in front of my neighbors, in front of people who've known me my whole life. That's not something I can just move past." McCullough nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand that, Mr. Reed, and we take this very seriously. The officers were acting on information they believed to be accurate at the time, but clearly mistakes were made." "Mistakes," Danny repeated, his voice rising slightly. "This wasn't just a mistake. It's part of a much larger problem, one that affects people like me every day. You didn't just arrest the wrong person you assumed based on the color of my skin." Officer Parker shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Officer Dawson glanced at her before speaking up. "Mr. Reed, I'm truly sorry for what happened. We were under a lot of pressure, and we thought we were doing the right thing. But I see now that we were wrong." Danny looked at Dawson, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "But it wasn't enough. It's not just about being wrong, Officer Dawson. It's about understanding why you were wrong. You saw me, a black man, and assumed I was guilty without any real evidence. That's not just a mistake. That's systemic bias." Officer Parker finally spoke, her voice quiet but defensive. "We were following procedure. We acted on the information we had." "Your procedures are broken then," Danny replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Because your procedures led to an innocent man being arrested in front of his community with no real cause." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Danny's words hanging in the air. Captain McCullough leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Mr. Reed, we're committed to reviewing our policies and procedures to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. We're willing to work with you and the community to make the necessary changes." Danny appreciated the gesture, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Words were one thing, but actions were what mattered. "Talking about change is one thing," Danny said, his voice firm, "but I need to see real action. I'm not the only person this has happened to, and I won't be the last unless something changes." McCullough nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "What do you suggest?" Danny paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He hadn't come into this meeting with a plan, but now, as he sat across from the people who had wronged him, he realized that he did know what he wanted. "We need more than just a policy review," Danny said. "We need to create opportunities for the police and the community to actually engage with each other. Not as adversaries, but as partners. There needs to be transparency. People need to feel like they can trust the police again." McCullough looked at him, considering his words. "I think that's something we can work on, Mr. Reed. If you're willing, I'd like to set up a series of community meetings, town halls, where people can voice their concerns and we can have open dialogue. He'll also commit to bringing in external trainers to focus on de-escalation and bias training for the officers." Danny felt a glimmer of hope. This was a small step toward something better. "I'll agree to that," Danny said, his voice steady. "But I'm holding you to it. This isn't just about me. It's about all the people who've been treated like this and never had the chance to speak up." The meeting ended on a cautiously optimistic note, but as Danny left the station, he knew there was still a long road ahead. Real change wouldn't happen overnight, and there would be resistance both from the police and from members of the community. But he had taken the first step. Now it was up to him to keep pushing forward. After the meeting with the police, Danny realized he couldn't do this alone. If he wanted to bring about real change, he needed to bring the community together and build a coalition of people who shared his vision for a better Colston. But that wasn't going to be easy. Danny's first call was to Alicia Banks, a prominent community organizer and activist who had been fighting for police reform in Colston for years. Alicia was known for her passion, her relentless drive, and her ability to mobilize people. She had organized protests, led petitions, and had never been afraid to speak out against injustice. They met at a small cafe downtown, and from the moment Alicia sat down across from Danny, she got straight to the point. "Danny, what happened to you is exactly why we've been pushing for reform," Alicia said, her eyes intense. "The police in this town have been acting like this for years. It's not just about you, it's about the system." Danny nodded. "I know. I just don't know where to start. I'm not an activist. I'm just trying to do the right thing." "You don't need to be an activist," Alicia replied. "You just need to speak up. People know you, Danny. They trust you. You're in a unique position to bring people together." They talked for hours, brainstorming ideas, and coming up with a plan to hold a town hall event where members of the community could come together to discuss their concerns about policing in Colston. Alicia would handle the logistics, while Danny would take on the role of inviting key figures in the community: business owners, religious leaders, educators, and even local politicians. As word spread about the upcoming town hall, Danny's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. Neighbors, colleagues, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years reached out to express their solidarity. But there were also skeptics, people who accused Danny of stirring up trouble, of trying to divide the community instead of bringing it together. It was a reminder that this fight was going to be easy. Alicia warned Danny that there would be resistance, especially from those who were comfortable with the status quo. "Change scares people," she said. "Even when it's necessary, they'll fight to keep things the way they are. But that's why we have to keep pushing." The date for the town hall was set, and as the day approached, Danny felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was his chance to stand up, to use his voice for something bigger than himself. But with that opportunity came the pressure to succeed. The weight of his father's legacy hung over him, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The town hall was held in the sanctuary of Reverend Adams' church, a symbolic gesture that tied the event to the civil rights struggles of the past. As Danny stood outside the church that evening, watching people file inside, he felt the enormity of the moment. This was more than just a meeting, it was the beginning of something bigger. The church was packed. Neighbors, community leaders, and even local reporters had come to see what would happen. The mood was tense but hopeful, with an undercurrent of frustration that had been simmering for years. People were ready for change, but they were also wary of empty promises. Danny sat in the front row, flanked by Alicia and Reverend Adams, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the notes he had prepared for his speech. His heart pounded in his chest, but when Reverend Adams introduced him and called him to the podium, Danny took a deep breath and stood up. The room fell silent as Danny began to speak. "I stand before you tonight as a man who was wronged," Danny began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'm not here to talk about my own experience. I'm here because what happened to me is part of a larger problem, one that affects all of us." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We can't keep living like this. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when so many people in this community are treated with suspicion and fear just because of the color of their skin." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Danny felt a surge of confidence. He spoke about his father's legacy, about the fight for justice and equality that Paul Reed had dedicated his life to. He talked about the need for real accountability, for transparency, and for a police force that served the people, not intimidated them. "We have a choice," Danny said, his voice rising. "We can keep turning a blind eye, or we can come together and demand better for ourselves, for our children, and for the future of this town." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in weeks, Danny felt a sense of hope. But the night wasn't over yet. As the applause died down, Alicia took the podium to introduce the next speaker, Captain McCullough, who had agreed to attend the event. He stood up and walked to the front, his face serious as he prepared to address the crowd. But before he could speak, a voice from the back of the room interrupted him. It was Officer Parker. "Danny," she called out, her voice tight, "I want to say something." The room fell silent as Parker stood up, her expression tense. Danny felt his heart rate quicken. He hadn't expected this. "I made a mistake," Parker began, her voice shaking slightly. "I wrongfully arrested you, and for that, I'm sorry. But I also believe that what we did was based on the information we had. We didn't act out of bias, we acted on what we thought was right." Climax 1 hit as the room erupted into a mix of anger and disbelief. People shouted in protest, demanding accountability from Parker, and some even called for her resignation. Danny stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. This was the moment he had feared, the confrontation he had known would come. The tension in the room was palpable, and it felt like everything was about to spiral out of control. But before things could escalate further, Reverend Adams stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to listen, not to fight. Officer Parker, we appreciate your words, but this is about more than just one mistake. It's about building trust again." The crowd quieted, but the tension remained. Parker sat back down, her face flushed with embarrassment, and Captain McCullough took the stage to try to salvage the situation. "We know there's a lot of work to be done," McCullough said, his voice measured. "We're committed to making the necessary changes, and we want to hear from you, the community, about how we can do better." The rest of the evening was filled with passionate discussions as community members shared their experiences with the police and their hopes for a better future. By the time the town hall ended, it was clear that while progress had been made, there was still a long road ahead. The next morning, Danny woke up to a flood of messages and notifications. The town hall had been a success in some ways, but the confrontation with Officer Parker had left the community divided. Some people praised Danny for his bravery in speaking out, while others accused him of stirring up unnecessary tension. The local paper ran a front-page article about the event, highlighting the outburst and casting doubt on whether real change could come from such heated discussions. Danny's inbox was filled with messages from reporters wanting interviews, civil rights groups offering legal advice, and community members expressing either support or frustration. As Danny scrolled through the messages, he felt overwhelmed. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had wanted to bring people together, but instead, it felt like the town was even more divided. Even his mother, Grace, called him that morning with words of caution. "Danny, I'm so proud of you for standing up," Grace said, her voice gentle. "But be careful. This kind of work, it's exhausting. Your father knew that better than anyone. Don't let it consume you." Danny appreciated her concern, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet." "I have to keep going, Mom," Danny replied, his voice determined. "I can't let this moment pass without doing something." Grace sighed softly. "I know. Just remember to take care of yourself, too." As the days went on, the fallout from the town hall continued. Alicia Banks called Danny regularly, reassuring him that they were making progress, even if it didn't feel like it yet. "Change is messy," Alicia said one evening as they planned the next steps. "It's not going to happen overnight, and there will always be people who push back. But we're doing the right thing. Don't lose sight of that." Danny nodded, even though he still felt the weight of the town's division pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the next fight, but he knew one thing for certain: couldn't turn back now. In the weeks following the town hall, Colston remained divided. Conversations about racial profiling and police misconduct were happening everywhere in homes, at work, and on street corners. The video of Danny's arrest continued to circulate, with people both inside and outside the town weighing in on the issue. The local media, and eventually national outlets, picked up the story, bringing even more attention to the small town. Danny, however, was feeling the pressure more than ever. The town hall had shown him that there was a thirst for change, but it had also revealed just how resistant some people were to addressing the deeper, systemic issues that plagued Colston. Every step forward seemed to be met with more resistance, and the weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him harder than ever. One afternoon, Danny met with Alicia Banks and Reverend Adams to discuss their next move. They gathered at the church again, the quiet sanctuary a place of solace for all of them. "We need to keep up the momentum," Alicia said, her voice firm. "We can't let the backlash scare us off." "I agree," Reverend Adams added. "But we need to be strategic. We've stirred the pot, but now we need to figure out how to calm the waters while still moving forward." Danny nodded, though inside he felt conflicted. He wanted to keep pushing, but he was also tired, emotionally drained from the constant pressure and scrutiny. The tension in the town was wearing on him, and he found himself wondering if he was really the right person to lead this fight. After all, he wasn't his father. Paul Reed had been a natural leader, someone who thrived in the spotlight, whereas Danny had always preferred the quiet, steady life he had built for himself. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," Danny admitted, his voice low. Alicia frowned. "Danny, you've already done more than most people would have. You're stepping up when it matters." "But that's just it," Danny said. "I'm not stepping up enough. People expect me to be like my father, and I'm not. I don't know how to be." Reverend Adams smiled gently. "Danny, your father wasn't perfect. He didn't always know what to do either. But he kept going because he knew the fight was bigger than him. And that's what you're doing, whether you realize it or not." Danny sighed, the weight of their words both comforting and heavy. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. "Well, keep going," Danny said finally, "but we need to be smart about it. We can't just react to everything that happens, we need to plan." Alicia smiled. "That's the spirit. Let's figure out our next move." While Danny and his team were strategizing, something unexpected was happening within the Colston Police Department. Officer Rachel Parker, whose defensive reaction at the town hall had fueled much of the community's frustration, was having a change of heart. In the weeks following the event, Parker found herself reflecting on what Danny and the others had said. For the first time, she started to question her own assumptions about policing and the biases that might have influenced her actions. She realized that, while she had always believed she was simply following protocol, the system itself might be flawed in ways she hadn't considered. Parker started attending some of the police department's new bias training sessions, which Captain McCullough had implemented after the town hall. Though the training was uncomfortable at times, it forced her to confront the systemic racism that she had long ignored. She began reading more about the history of racial inequality in policing, and for the first time, she saw herself as part of that system, part of the problem. One afternoon, Parker decided to reach out to Danny. She wasn't sure if he'd even agree to meet with her, but she knew she had to try. She sent him a message, apologizing for how she had handled things at the town hall and asking if they could talk. To her surprise, Danny responded almost immediately. He agreed to meet her for coffee later that week. When they sat down together at a small cafe downtown, the air between them was tense but civil. Danny could see that Parker was nervous, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me," Parker said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the town hall, and I realize now that I was wrong about a lot of things." Danny studied her face, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He hadn't expected this. After their confrontation, he had assumed Parker would double down on her stance, refusing to acknowledge the deeper issues at play. But here she was, admitting that she had been wrong. "I've been working in this system for years," Parker continued, her voice heavy with regret. "And I always thought I was doing the right thing. But I see now that I was part of the problem. I didn't listen when you told me that what happened to you wasn't just a mistake, it was part of something bigger. And I'm sorry for that." Danny nodded slowly. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong. I respect that you're here, trying to make it right." Parker looked down at her cup, her expression pained. "I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution, but I don't know how. I feel like I've been blind for so long." Danny sighed, understanding the weight of her words. "It's not going to be easy. Changing the way we think and act it takes time. But the fact that you're willing to do that, to learn and grow, is a good start." Parker smiled faintly, a small flicker of hope in her eyes. "I'm committed to this, Danny. I want to work with you, with the community, to rebuild the trust that's been broken. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new." Danny didn't know if he could fully trust Parker, but he could see that she was genuinely trying. And that was more than he had expected. After meeting with Parker, Danny realized that if real change was going to happen in Colston, it couldn't be an us versus them situation. The community and the police needed to work together, not against each other. But building that bridge of trust would be one of the hardest challenges yet. With Alicia and Reverend Adams by his side, Danny started organizing small community events aimed at fostering open dialogue between the police and residents. These events weren't as formal or high-pressure as the town hall had been instead. They were casual gatherings held at local parks and community centers, where people could come together to talk, share their experiences, and find common ground. One of the first events they organized was a coffee with a cop day at a local cafe. Officers from the Colston Police Department, including Parker and Dawson, showed up in plain clothes to talk with community members over coffee and pastries. The atmosphere was initially tense, with many people still harboring distrust and anger toward the police. But as the conversations began, some of those barriers started to come down. "I never realized how scared people were of us," Officer Dawson admitted during one of the conversations. "I thought we were doing our job keeping people safe. But now I see that for some, we were the source of fear, not safety." Danny watched as the officers and residents engaged in difficult but necessary conversations. People shared their stories of being racially profiled, of feeling unsafe in their own neighborhoods, and the officers listened, really listened, for the first time. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension. Some people remained skeptical of the police, unwilling to believe that real change was possible. But for Danny, it felt like progress. Slowly, but surely, they were starting to build a foundation of trust. The events continued over the next few months. Alicia helped organize a community cleanup day where residents and police officers worked side by side to beautify the town. Reverend Adams led a series of workshops on restorative justice, inviting both the police and community members to participate. The workshops focused on healing the wounds that had been caused by years of mistrust and systemic inequality. Danny could see the impact these events were having, both on the community and the police. The officers who had once been defensive and resistant to change were now more open, more willing to listen and learn. And while the community was still cautious, there was a growing sense of hope. Several months after the first town hall, Danny, Alicia, and Reverend Adams decided it was time to hold another large-scale eventone that would bring together all the work they had done over the past few months. This time, they wanted it to be a celebration of the progress that had been made, while also acknowledging that there was still much work to be done. The second town hall was held at the community center, and it drew an even larger crowd than the first. People from all over Colston came, eager to hear about the changes that had taken place and to discuss what more needed to be done. Danny once again took the stage. But this time, he felt more confident, more sure of his role in all of this. "We've come a long way since our first meeting," Danny began, his voice strong and clear. "But we're not done yet. We've started to build bridges, to rebuild the trust that was broken. But real change takes time, and it takes all of us working together, holding each other accountable, and staying committed to justice." The crowd was attentive, and as Danny spoke, he could feel the energy in the room. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community, about the people who had come together to demand something better for themselves and for future generations. Climax 2 came when Officer Parker stood up to speak. This time she wasn't defensive or dismissive. Instead, she shared her own journey, her realization that she had been part of a system that was broken, and her commitment to being part of the solution. "I used to think that as long as I followed the rules, I was doing my job," Parker said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I've learned that it's not enough to just follow the rules. We have to question the rules. We have to be willing to change them when they're wrong. And I'm committed to doing that from the inside out." The room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of applause broke out. It was a powerful momentum that signaled a shift not just for Parker, but for the entire town. After the second town hall, the momentum continued to build. Danny, Alicia, and Reverend Adams worked with Captain McCullough and other leaders in the police department to push for concrete policy changes that would address the issues of racial profiling and systemic bias. One of the first victories came when the police department agreed to implement body cameras for all officers, a move that would increase transparency and accountability. They also began working on a new de-escalation training program, designed to reduce the number of violent encounters between the police and residents. But the fight wasn't over. Danny knew that real change wouldn't happen with a few policy shifts. It would take years of hard work, of staying vigilant and holding the police accountable. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. But for the first time, Danny felt like they were moving in the right direction. As the months passed, Danny found himself reflecting on his journey. What had started as a traumatic experience, his wrongful arrest had turned into something much bigger. He had been forced to confront his father's legacy, to step into a role he had never imagined for himself. But through it all, Danny had grown. He had learned that he didn't have to be his father to make a difference. He had found his own voice, his own way of leading. And while the weight of his father's legacy still hung over him, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift, something he could carry with him as he continued to fight for justice. Danny also found a sense of balance in his life. He had thrown himself into the fight for change, but he knew that he couldn't let it consume him. His mother, Grace, had been his rock throughout it all, reminding him to take care of himself and to remember the things that brought him peace. In the quiet moments, Danny found solace in his family, in his friends, and in the small, everyday acts of kindness that had always been a part of his life. He had learned that change didn't always come in the form of grand gestures. It often came in the small, quiet moments that made up a life. Around him, the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. The event is held at the same community center where the second town hall took place, but this time the mood is light and celebratory. Families gather, children play, and the air is filled with laughter and music. It's a stark contrast to the tension and anger that had filled the room during the first town hall. There's still work to be done. Danny knows that, but today is a day to celebrate the victories they've won. As Danny stands at the edge of the crowd, watching people mingle and laugh, he feels a deep sense of peace. He has found his place in this fight, his own way of carrying forward his father's legacy. And though the road ahead will be long, he knows that he's not walking it alone. Alicia and Reverend Adams join him, their faces glowing with pride. "We've done good work, Danny," Alicia says, smiling. "But this is just the beginning." Danny nods, feeling a surge of hope. "Yeah, just the beginning." As the event continues, Danny looks around at the people he has come to know and love, the people who have stood with him through the hardest year of his life. And for the first time in a long while, he feels hopeful about the future. As the community event continued, Danny smiled, reflecting on the incredible journey he had been on. From the moment of his wrongful arrest to standing at the forefront of meaningful change, he had grown in ways he never expected. Now, he was filled with hope for the future, not just for himself, but for his entire community. This story is one of healing, growth, and the power of unity. It shows us that change is possible, even in the face of adversity, and that each of us has a role to play in building a better world. Sean, I've been talking to some people in the civil rights community, and there's a real opportunity here. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have responded like Danny did? How do you think communities can work together for change? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay hopeful, stay kind, and let's continue to make the world a better place, one story at a time. Sean was silent for a moment, considering Ethan's words. He had been so focused on winning the trial that he hadn't thought much about what would come next. But now that the dust was settling, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. His fight for justice had resonated with people all over the country, and he had the chance to make a real difference. "I'm in," Sean said, his voice steady. "I just wanted you to know that. We'll work together on this. There's a long road ahead, but I think we can really make an impact." Sean hung up the phone, a sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something much larger, a future where no one would have to endure what he had gone through. If you've enjoyed this story and want to follow along with more inspiring and powerful content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated. Your support helps us bring these important stories to life and keeps the conversation going. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for being part of this journey. "Thank you all for being here today," Ethan began, his voice steady and strong. "This center represents more than just a building. It represents a commitment to standing together, to supporting each other, and to fighting for the rights of those who have served this country, regardless of their background." The crowd applauded, the energy in the room warm and uplifting. "We've all faced challenges," Ethan continued, "but those challenges don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we lift each other up, and how we keep pushing for a better future." As Ethan finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. He stepped down from the podium, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The investigation had come to an end, and many of the people involved had been brought to justice. Sophia hugged him tightly, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan smiled, holding her close. "We did it." In the months that followed, Ethan and Sophia continued to grow their involvement in the community. The new center became a hub for veterans and families, a place where people could come together to share their stories, find support, and work toward solutions. Ryan Carter, meanwhile, had fully committed to his new role within the department, working to address bias and promote better community relations. It wasn't always easy, and he faced resistance from some of his fellow officers, but he knew that the work was important. One day, as Ryan was leaving a meeting at the department, he ran into Ethan in the hallway. The two men exchanged a brief glance, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. Ethan nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Ryan returned the nod, a silent agreement that while they couldn't change the past, they were both working toward a better future. As they went their separate ways, both men felt a sense of resolution, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but that they were walking it in the right direction. The sun was setting on a warm evening as Ethan and Sophia sat on their porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The world around them was still filled with challenges, but they had found their place in it, standing together, fighting for justice, and building something better for the next generation. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sophia reached over and took Ethan's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And we've still got a long way to go." Sophia nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "But we'll get there." Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, ready for whatever battles the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more like it, filled with powerful lessons, compelling characters, and deep emotional journeys, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community as we continue to share meaningful stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more. We're committed to bringing you stories that explore important issues, from justice to resilience and everything in between. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on the themes explored in this story. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and well, see you in the next video. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible. People like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love, it was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything.